September 14th, 1944. Camp Ruston, Louisiana. Humid air thick enough to cut with a knife. Behind towering wire fences topped with menacing coils of barbed steel, 4,200 German prisoners of war sit in stunned silence as American guards prepare something their captors back in the fatherland had never mentioned in their briefings about enemy cruelty. A movie projector clicks to mechanical life in the camp's makeshift recreation hall, casting flickering shadows across faces that still bear the dust of North African battlefields and Norman hedgerows. Tonight's feature presentation, Gone with the Wind, 4 hours of American cinema that would shatter every propaganda myth these men had been fed about their barbaric captors. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Mueller, veteran of Rommel's Afrika Korps, stares at the silver screen with the same intensity he once reserved for British tank formations approaching across desert sand. This isn't interrogation. This isn't psychological torture designed to break fighting spirits. This is something far more dangerous to Nazi ideology than any physical hardship could ever be. This is America showing German prisoners exactly what kind of nation they had been fighting against. The contradiction between expectation and reality would prove more devastating to fascist beliefs than any re-education program ever devised. 3 months earlier, Mueller had surrendered outside Cherbourg with the bitter taste of defeat, mixing with relief that his war was finally over. 2 years of combat across North Africa and France had taught him everything about American firepower, logistics, and tactical competence. But Wehrmacht intelligence briefings had prepared him for capture by enemies who would demonstrate the same brutal efficiency they showed on battlefields. Geneva Convention protections were meaningless pieces of paper when dealing with capitalist warmongers who valued only industrial production and material wealth. German prisoners should expect starvation rations, forced labour under inhumane conditions, and psychological torture designed to extract military intelligence through methods that civilized nations would never employ. The reality that greeted Mueller at Camp Ruston challenged every assumption the Nazi propaganda machine had carefully constructed about American character and values. The train journey from the East Coast Processing Center had been his first indication that something was fundamentally different about American prisoner management. Instead of cattle cars packed with human cargo, German POWs travelled in standard passenger coaches with cushioned seats and functioning toilets. Guards distributed sandwiches, coffee and cigarettes during stops, treating prisoners with casual courtesy that seemed almost incomprehensible after years of military discipline that emphasized rigid hierarchy and absolute obedience. Mueller found himself sitting across from Sergeant Bill Henderson, a farm boy from Iowa who spoke broken German, learned from immigrant grandparents, and seemed genuinely curious about life in Bavaria before the war began. The conversation that followed would, have been impossible between German guards and Allied prisoners, revealing cultural differences that extended far beyond military protocols into fundamental approaches to human dignity under impossible circumstances. Henderson produced photographs of his family's farm, pointing out Holstein cattle that reminded Mueller of livestock's questions about German agricultural methods, cheese production, and traditional from his own village outside Munich. The American Sergeant festivals revealed interests that transcended military necessity. This wasn't intelligence gathering disguised as friendly conversation. This was genuine human curiosity about how other people lived their lives before politics and warfare transformed ordinary citizens into enemies who killed each other over ideological abstractions that most soldiers barely understood. Mueller discovered himself describing Oktoberfest celebrations, alpine hiking trails, and Christmas market traditions with nostalgic warmth that he hadn't felt since leaving home 2 years earlier. The enemy soldier across from him listened with apparent fascination, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated real interest rather than professional interrogation techniques. Camp Ruston's gates opened to reveal facilities that bore no resemblance to concentration camps or Soviet gulags that German propaganda claimed represented standard Allied prisoner treatment. Instead of overcrowded barracks designed for maximum human misery, Mueller found himself assigned to a wooden structure that housed 20 men in individual bunks with clean mattresses, adequate blankets, and storage space for personal belongings. The mess hall served portions that exceeded Wehrmacht field rations in both quantity and quality, with American guards eating identical meals alongside German prisoners in demonstrations of equality that violated every Nazi teaching about racial hierarchy and cultural superiority. Recreation facilities included libraries stocked with German literature, sports equipment for football matches that drew enthusiastic crowds, and workshop spaces where prisoners could pursue carpentry, metalworking, and artistic projects that maintained sanity through creative expression rather than mindless labor designed to break human spirits. The revelation that prisoners could write uncensored letters home, receive packages from family members, and maintain contact with the outside world contradicted intelligence briefings that had promised complete isolation from everything that made life worth living. Mueller's first letter to his wife Maria passed through American censors who removed only tactical military information while leaving personal details, emotional expressions, and family concerns completely intact. Her response arrived 3 weeks later, describing life in wartime Munich with candor that suggested American authorities weren't monitoring correspondence for propaganda purposes or using family communications as psychological weapons against imprisoned soldiers. The letter contained photographs of their daughter Anna, now 7 years old, playing in bombed-out streets with resilience that children somehow maintained regardless of circumstances beyond their control. Medical care provided additional evidence that American prisoner treatment followed Geneva Convention requirements, rather than revenge fantasies that Wehrmacht officers had predicted would characterize enemy behavior toward captured German personnel. Camp Ruston's hospital maintained standards that exceeded those available to German civilians in bombed-out cities, where Allied bombing campaigns had destroyed healthcare infrastructure along with military targets. Dr. Raymond Walsh, a Chicago physician serving as camp medical officer, treated German prisoners with identical protocols used for American personnel, explaining procedures in careful German and ensuring that patients understood their treatment options. When Mueller developed pneumonia during Louisiana's brutal summer humidity, Dr. Walsh personally supervised antibiotic therapy that saved his life, while demonstrating medical ethics that transcended national boundaries or wartime animosities. The camp's educational programs revealed American attitudes toward prisoner rehabilitation that contradicted Nazi expectations about capitalist brutality and cultural barbarism. German prisoners could attend English language classes taught by volunteers from nearby Louisiana State University, participate in technical training programs that prepared them for post-war civilian occupations, and pursue academic studies through correspondence courses with American universities willing to accept enemy soldiers as legitimate students. Professor Margaret Thompson from LSU's German department arrived twice weekly to conduct literature seminars discussing Goethe, Schiller and Mann, with enthusiasm that suggested genuine scholarly interest rather than propaganda manipulation disguised as cultural education. Her knowledge of German poetry exceeded that of most Wehrmacht officers, revealing educational depth that challenged Nazi claims about American intellectual inferiority and cultural shallowness. The recreational activities that Camp Ruston provided for German prisoners represented perhaps the most dramatic contradiction between expectation and reality that Mueller encountered during his entire captivity experience. Instead of mindless entertainment designed to pacify dangerous enemies, American authorities encouraged cultural expression that maintained German identity while exposing prisoners to democratic values through voluntary participation rather than forced indoctrination. The camp orchestra performed monthly concerts featuring both German classical music and American popular songs, with instruments provided by the War Department and sheet music donated by civilian organizations that viewed cultural exchange as essential for post-war reconciliation between former enemies who would need to coexist in whatever peace emerged from global conflict. Camp Ruston's softball league included teams composed entirely of German prisoners competing against mixed American-German squads in games that drew enthusiastic crowds from both populations. The competitive spirit that emerged during these matches revealed shared human experiences that transcended national boundaries, creating friendships between former enemies who discovered common interests in athletic achievement and good-natured competition. Mueller found himself cheering for American players who demonstrated exceptional skill while maintaining respect for German teammates, who refused to surrender their competitive pride despite circumstances that might have justified demoralization and defeat. The evening of September 14th marked a turning point that would reshape Mueller's understanding of American society and democratic values through cinematic experience that Nazi propaganda had never prepared him to encounter. As Camp Ruston's prisoners filed into the recreation hall for their weekly movie presentation, the anticipation was palpable among men who had been deprived of entertainment for months of combat and captivity. The projector's mechanical whir filled the recreation hall as American guards distributed popcorn and Coca-Cola to German prisoners who had never experienced such casual luxury during their military service. Mueller accepted his portion with bewildered gratitude, understanding that this simple gesture represented something profound about American values that Wehrmacht intelligence had completely failed to comprehend. The carbonated sweetness of Coca-Cola, forbidden in Germany as a symbol of capitalist decadence, provided his first taste of the consumer culture that Nazi ideology had condemned as spiritually corrupting and materially wasteful. Captain James Morrison, Camp Ruston's commanding officer, stood before the assembled prisoners with the relaxed bearing of someone who understood that effective prisoner management required treating captured enemies as human beings rather than dangerous animals requiring constant suppression. His brief introduction to the evening's entertainment carried none of the harsh authority that German officers employed when addressing subordinates, instead demonstrating the informal leadership style that characterized American military culture throughout the war. "Tonight we're showing Gone with the Wind," Morrison announced in carefully pronounced German that revealed genuine effort to communicate respectfully with his charges, rather than simply barking orders they were expected to follow without question. "It's a long film, nearly 4 hours, so we'll have an intermission halfway through. The story takes place during our Civil War, about 80 years ago, when Americans fought each other over questions that nearly destroyed our nation. I think you'll find it interesting to see how we remember our own national struggles." The opening credits rolled across the screen as 4,200 German prisoners settled into wooden chairs that American carpenters had constructed specifically for these weekly movie presentations. The attention to detail was remarkable, from the carefully positioned screen that provided optimal viewing angles to the sound system that delivered crystal-clear dialogue throughout the large hall. This wasn't makeshift entertainment designed to occupy restless prisoners for a few hours. This was a professional cinema experience that rivaled movie theaters in major German cities before the war began. Vivian Lee's Scarlett O'Hara appeared on screen in Technicolor splendor that drew gasps of appreciation from prisoners who had grown accustomed to the grey monotony of military life and the black and white newsreels that constituted their primary visual entertainment for the past several years. The lush Georgia plantation scenes that opened the film revealed American prosperity that Nazi propaganda had claimed was built entirely on the exploitation of weaker nations and racial minorities. Yet here was evidence of agricultural abundance and architectural grandeur that existed long before America became a global industrial power. Mueller found himself studying the film with analytical intensity that surprised him. Every costume, every piece of furniture, every architectural detail provided insights into American culture that contradicted German assumptions about capitalist society and democratic values. The elaborate ball gowns worn by Southern belles suggested artistic sophistication that Nazi intellectuals had dismissed as impossible in a nation devoted exclusively to material accumulation and industrial production. The formal social customs depicted in plantation society revealed cultural traditions that possessed genuine depth, rather than the shallow commercialism that German propaganda claimed characterized all American social relationships. The character of Ashley Wilkes particularly intrigued German viewers who recognized in his gentle intellectualism something familiar from European aristocratic traditions. His devotion to literature, philosophy, and romantic idealism resonated with prisoners who had been taught that American men were incapable of such refined sensibilities because capitalism destroyed everything noble and beautiful in human nature. Yet here was an American film celebrating intellectual pursuits and moral principles that transcended mere financial success or material advancement. Sergeant Friedrich Weber, a veteran of the Russian front who had witnessed horrors that no human being should experience, found himself emotionally invested in Scarlett's struggle to save Tara Plantation from destruction and starvation. Her determination to survive despite overwhelming obstacles reminded him of his own wife's letters describing life in bombed-out Hamburg, where German civilians demonstrated identical resilience under circumstances that tested human endurance beyond reasonable limits. The universal nature of human suffering and determination became apparent as he watched American cinema depicting themes that transcended national boundaries and political ideologies. The intermission arrived at precisely the moment when Scarlett vowed never to be hungry again, her silhouette dramatically framed against a burning Atlanta skyline that bore uncomfortable resemblance to German cities under Allied bombing campaigns. American guards encouraged prisoners to stretch their legs, use restroom facilities, and discuss the film's first half with fellow viewers, who brought diverse perspectives to cinematic analysis that revealed cultural sophistication among German military personnel that their captors had not expected to encounter. Conversations throughout the recreation hall revealed the profound impact that professional American cinema was having on prisoners who had never experienced entertainment that combined technical excellence with emotional depth and intellectual substance. Corporal Hans Zimmermann, a former teacher from Dresden, engaged several American guards in discussions about cinematography techniques, costume design, and musical scoring that demonstrated his appreciation for artistic achievement regardless of its national origin. The guards responded with enthusiasm rather than suspicion, sharing technical details about Hollywood production methods and discussing other films that might interest prisoners with similar cultural sophistication. The second half of Gone with the Wind provided even more powerful testimony to American cultural achievements that Nazi propaganda had systematically undermined through selective presentation of evidence that supported ideological preconceptions while ignoring contrary information. Rhett Butler's cynical wisdom about war, politics, and human nature resonated with combat veterans who had witnessed enough death and destruction to question the romantic nationalism that had initially motivated their military service. His famous declaration that he didn't give a damn challenged the rigid ideological certainty that characterized Nazi political culture, while suggesting that individual conscience might sometimes transcend collective loyalty. The film's treatment of slavery presented German viewers with America's honest acknowledgement of historical injustices that the nation had struggled to overcome through political processes that Nazi Germany had rejected in favor of racial theories that denied fundamental human equality. While the movie's portrayal reflected the attitudes of its 1939 production date rather than contemporary understanding of racial issues, its basic recognition that slavery was morally wrong provided evidence of American self-criticism that contrasted sharply with Nazi ideology's refusal to acknowledge any flaws in German racial superiority theories. Scarlett's final scene, where she resolves to think about her problems tomorrow while standing against another dramatic sunset, left German prisoners contemplating themes of hope, resilience, and renewal that offered alternatives to the fatalistic despair that Nazi propaganda promoted as appropriate responses to military defeat. The movie's suggestion that individuals could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances through personal determination and community support provided philosophical perspectives that many prisoners had never encountered during their indoctrination in totalitarian political systems that emphasized collective identity over individual responsibility. As the final credits rolled and American guards began preparing the recreation hall for its return to normal activities, Mueller realized that he had just experienced something that would permanently alter his understanding of American society and democratic values. This wasn't propaganda disguised as entertainment, attempting to convert German prisoners to capitalism through subtle ideological manipulation. This was genuine artistic achievement that revealed cultural depth and emotional sophistication that Nazi intellectuals had claimed was impossible in materialistic democratic societies devoted exclusively to commercial success and individual gratification. The walk back to the barracks occurred in thoughtful silence as prisoners processed what they had witnessed during 4 hours of American cinema that challenged every assumption they had held about enemy culture and values. Gone with the Wind had demonstrated that Americans possessed the artistic sophistication necessary to create entertainment that addressed universal human themes through technical excellence and emotional authenticity that rivaled the greatest achievements of European cultural tradition. The following morning brought revelations that extended far beyond cinematic entertainment into fundamental questions about American society that German prisoners had never been encouraged to consider during their military service. Breakfast conversation in Camp Ruston's mess hall buzzed with animated discussions about Gone with the Wind's portrayal of American regional differences, social customs, and historical perspectives that revealed cultural complexity Nazi propaganda had systematically concealed from German audiences who might have questioned simplistic characterizations of democratic societies as spiritually hollow and intellectually bankrupt. Obergefreiter Ernst Hoffmann, a philosophy student from Heidelberg before conscription into Wehrmacht service, found himself engaged in passionate debate with fellow prisoners about the film's treatment of individual conscience versus social obligation. Rhett Butler's rejection of Confederate patriotism in favor of personal survival had resonated with combat veterans who understood the difference between romantic nationalism and battlefield reality. The characters' cynical observations about war's true nature challenged ideological certainties that had sustained German military morale through years of increasingly desperate fighting across multiple theaters of operation. American guards participated in these discussions with intellectual curiosity that surprised prisoners accustomed to military hierarchies that discouraged philosophical speculation among enlisted personnel. Sergeant Mike O'Brien, a former college student from Boston, demonstrated familiarity with German philosophers that exceeded most Wehrmacht officers' knowledge of American intellectual traditions. His comments about Nietzsche's influence on contemporary German thought revealed educational depth that contradicted Nazi claims about democratic society's inability to produce serious scholarship or meaningful cultural achievements beyond commercial entertainment and industrial production. The revelation that American guards possessed genuine intellectual interests rather than simply following orders without question provided additional evidence that democratic military culture operated according to principles fundamentally different from authoritarian systems that demanded absolute obedience without understanding. O'Brien's willingness to engage German prisoners in philosophical discussions demonstrated confidence in democratic values that required no propaganda reinforcement or ideological indoctrination to maintain soldier loyalty and military effectiveness under combat conditions. Camp Ruston's library became Mueller's refuge during the weeks following that transformative movie experience, offering access to American literature that Nazi cultural authorities had banned as degenerate expressions of capitalist materialism and democratic individualism. The works of Mark Twain, Walt Whitman, and Ernest Hemingway revealed literary traditions that possessed genuine artistic merit, rather than the shallow commercialism that German propaganda claimed characterized all American cultural production designed exclusively for mass consumption and financial profit. Twain's satirical observations about American society demonstrated the kind of self-critical perspective that totalitarian systems could never tolerate, because honest examination of social problems might encourage citizens to question official ideology and political leadership. The author's willingness to mock American pretensions and expose societal hypocrisies revealed cultural confidence that allowed democratic societies to acknowledge their flaws while working toward improvement through political processes that Nazi Germany had rejected as weakness disguised as democratic virtue. Hemingway's war stories provided particularly powerful testimony to American literary sophistication in addressing themes that German authors had explored through different cultural perspectives but with similar emotional depth and intellectual honesty. The writer's spare prose style and psychological insight into combat trauma resonated with prisoners who recognized authentic battlefield experience translated into artistic expression that transcended national boundaries and ideological differences between former enemies who shared common human experiences despite fighting on opposite sides. The camp's weekly movie schedule continued revealing American cultural achievements that systematically demolished Nazi assumptions about democratic society's artistic limitations and spiritual poverty. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington presented prisoners with Frank Capra's celebration of individual conscience, triumphing over political corruption through democratic processes that Nazi ideology claimed were impossible, because capitalism inevitably corrupted all public institutions and reduced civic participation to meaningless rituals that concealed plutocratic control. James Stewart's portrayal of Jefferson Smith resonated with German viewers who recognized in his character something familiar from their own cultural traditions of individual moral responsibility and civic duty. The film's suggestion that ordinary citizens could challenge powerful interests through legitimate political channels provided evidence of democratic vitality that contradicted propaganda claims about American political system's fundamental dishonesty and moral bankruptcy that made genuine reform impossible under capitalist economic structures. The movie's treatment of Senate procedures revealed American political culture's commitment to debate, compromise, and institutional continuity that Nazi Germany had abandoned in favor of leader principle and ideological purity that brooked no dissent or alternative perspectives. Smith's filibuster demonstrated democratic traditions that encouraged individual expression, even when opposing majority opinion or challenging established authority through constitutionally protected processes rather than revolutionary violence or authoritarian decree. Prisoners found themselves analysing American political institutions with scholarly interest that surprised their captors, who had expected enemy soldiers to maintain rigid ideological opposition to democratic values, regardless of evidence that contradicted their pre-war indoctrination. The discussions that emerged from these weekly movie presentations revealed intellectual curiosity that extended far beyond simple entertainment into serious examination of alternative political systems that might offer solutions to problems that totalitarian approaches had failed to address effectively. Dr. Walsh's medical rounds provided opportunities for individual conversations that revealed the profound psychological impact these cinematic experiences were having on prisoners whose worldview had been systematically challenged by exposure to American cultural achievements they had never been allowed to consider during their Nazi education. Many prisoners admitted privately that their assumptions about American society required fundamental revision in light of evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught about democratic culture and capitalist civilization. The transformation was particularly evident among younger prisoners who had received their entire education under Nazi control and possessed no personal memory of pre-war German society that might have provided alternative perspectives on American culture and democratic values. For these men, weekly movies represented their first exposure to artistic achievements that revealed the cultural sophistication that Nazi propaganda had systematically concealed from German audiences, who might have questioned official characterizations of American society as spiritually bankrupt and intellectually sterile. Corporal Wolfgang Brenner, barely 19 years old when captured during the Battle of the Bulge, confided to Dr. Walsh during a routine medical examination that the movies had forced him to reconsider everything he believed about America and its people. The revelation that American society could produce entertainment of such technical excellence and emotional depth while maintaining democratic political institutions challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between cultural achievement and political systems that Nazi ideology insisted were mutually exclusive. The educational impact extended beyond individual prisoners into collective discussions that revealed changing attitudes toward American society and democratic values among German military personnel, who had been trained to view their captors as cultural barbarians whose material prosperity concealed spiritual emptiness and moral corruption. These conversations often continued long into the night as prisoners processed cinematic experiences that provided evidence contradicting years of ideological indoctrination designed to sustain military morale through dehumanization of enemy populations. The arrival of new prisoner shipments from European battlefields provided opportunities to share these revelations with recently captured German soldiers who arrived at Camp Ruston with expectations based on Wehrmacht intelligence briefings that bore no resemblance to actual American prisoner treatment. The contrast between anticipated brutality and experienced humanity created cognitive dissonance, that forced new arrivals to question fundamental assumptions about American character and democratic society that Nazi propaganda had carefully constructed to justify aggressive war against Western democracies. Lieutenant Hans Kruger, captured during the Rhine crossing operations, arrived at Camp Ruston expecting concentration camp conditions and brutal interrogation procedures designed to extract military intelligence through torture methods that civilized nations would never employ against enemy prisoners. His first week of captivity provided systematic demolition of every assumption Wehrmacht officers had been taught about American treatment of German military personnel, under circumstances that tested democratic values against wartime emotions demanding revenge for battlefield losses. The weekly movie presentation that introduced Kruger to American prisoner management philosophy featured Casablanca, Humphrey Bogart's portrayal of cynical American expatriate Rick Blaine, who ultimately chooses moral principle over personal safety in occupied Morocco. The film's treatment of resistance against Nazi occupation provided German prisoners with American perspectives on their own nation's wartime behavior that many had never been encouraged to consider during their military service under authoritarian leadership that demanded absolute loyalty without question or moral reflection. The movie's famous ending, where Rick sacrifices personal happiness to support the anti-Nazi resistance, presented German viewers with evidence of American moral sophistication that contradicted propaganda claims about capitalist society's fundamental selfishness and inability to recognize principles more important than individual material advantage. Bogart's character demonstrated the kind of moral courage that Nazi ideology claimed was impossible in democratic societies, corrupted by materialism and individualistic values that prevented collective sacrifice for noble causes. The psychological impact of these weekly cinematic experiences accumulated over months of captivity as German prisoners gradually developed more nuanced understanding of American society and democratic culture through exposure to artistic achievements that revealed intellectual depth and emotional sophistication that Nazi education had systematically concealed from German audiences, who might have questioned official characterizations of Western democracies as spiritually bankrupt and culturally inferior to German civilization. The revelation that American authorities permitted German prisoners to request specific films created an entirely new dynamic that transformed weekly movie presentations from passive entertainment into collaborative cultural exchange between former enemies discovering shared artistic interests. Mueller submitted a formal request through camp channels for German films that might be available through American distribution networks, expecting bureaucratic rejection or suspicious interrogation about his motives for seeking enemy propaganda disguised as entertainment. Instead, Captain Morrison responded within days with news that Warner Brothers possessed several German films from the pre-war period, including productions that had been imported before hostilities began and stored in studio archives awaiting potential peacetime distribution. The captain's willingness to accommodate prisoner requests demonstrated administrative flexibility that contradicted Wehrmacht intelligence briefings about rigid American initiative under layers of procedural requirements designed to prevent creative military bureaucracy that crushed individual thinking or unauthorized innovation. The screening of Der Student von Prague, a 1935 German production that predated Nazi cinematic control, provided German prisoners with unexpected opportunity to view their own cultural achievements through American projection equipment, operated by guards who demonstrated genuine interest in foreign filmmaking techniques and artistic traditions. The silent film's expressionist visual style drew appreciative comments from American personnel who recognized technical innovations that had influenced Hollywood cinematography during the 1920s, when German directors emigrated to California studios seeking creative opportunities unavailable under increasingly restrictive European political conditions. Sergeant Henderson's questions about German film production methods revealed knowledge of international cinema that surprised prisoners accustomed to American cultural isolation that Nazi propaganda claimed prevented democratic societies from appreciating foreign artistic achievements. His familiarity with directors like F.W. Murnau and Fritz Lang demonstrated educational breadth that contradicted stereotypes about American intellectual limitations and cultural provincialism that German education had promoted to justify feelings of European cultural superiority over materialistic democratic societies. The technical discussion that followed the screening revealed American appreciation for German cinematic innovations that had revolutionized motion picture production during the Weimar Republic, before political circumstances destroyed the creative freedom necessary for artistic experimentation. Guards and prisoners found themselves analyzing camera techniques, lighting effects, and editing methods with scholarly enthusiasm that transcended national boundaries and wartime animosities through shared recognition of professional excellence, regardless of its cultural origins. Camp Ruston's movie discussions began attracting civilian visitors from nearby Louisiana communities who possessed academic or professional interest in international cinema and European culture. Professor Thompson from LSU's German department brought colleagues from the university's film studies program who engaged German prisoners in technical conversations about montage theory, visual symbolism, and narrative structure that demonstrated American scholarly sophistication in fields that Nazi intellectuals had claimed were beyond democratic comprehension. These academic exchanges revealed the profound intellectual hunger among German prisoners, who had been deprived of serious cultural discourse during years of military service, where political indoctrination replaced genuine education and ideological conformity suppressed the kind of free intellectual exchange that characterized American university environments. The opportunity to discuss artistic theory with American professors provided psychological relief from the mental isolation that totalitarian systems imposed on individuals whose intellectual curiosity extended beyond officially approved subjects. The arrival of Hollywood executives conducting research for post-war film projects created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange between German prisoners and American entertainment industry professionals who viewed former enemies as valuable sources of information about European audience preferences and cultural traditions that might influence international distribution strategies after military hostilities concluded. Producer Samuel Goldwyn Jr. spent an entire afternoon at Camp Ruston interviewing German prisoners about their reactions to American films and their suggestions for productions that might appeal to post-war European audiences seeking entertainment that addressed themes of reconstruction, reconciliation, and hope for peaceful international relations. His respectful treatment of enemy soldiers as knowledgeable cultural critics, rather than dangerous prisoners requiring constant surveillance, demonstrated American confidence in democratic values that required no propaganda reinforcement to maintain their appeal. The conversations revealed German appreciation for American technical achievements in color cinematography, sound recording, and special effects that exceeded European capabilities even before wartime destruction eliminated most German film production facilities. Prisoners expressed particular admiration for Disney animation techniques that created entertainment, suitable for both children and adults through artistic sophistication, that combined technical innovation with storytelling traditions that transcended cultural boundaries through universal themes of heroism, friendship, and moral triumph over adversity. By war's end, thousands of German prisoners would return to their homeland carrying memories that no propaganda ministry could erase. They had witnessed American democracy not through political speeches or military demonstrations, but through the simple act of sharing popcorn while watching movies together. In recreation halls across Louisiana, Texas, and a dozen other states, the real victory had been won not on battlefields but in darkened rooms where former enemies discovered their shared humanity. The projectors would fall silent, the camps would empty, but the understanding that flickered to life on those silver screens would illuminate the path toward a different kind of peace.